So I just give you a short overview about the next hour. We are about 200, a little bit more than 200 people who are here via Zoom, and everybody had the possibility to bring in questions in advance. And we structured it, as you saw, in 3 categories. And Suzanne and Stephanie, these are students from our master program, will ask you the questions.
Great.
And Stephanie and Suzanne, would you say hello?
Yes, hello. Good morning and good evening from Austria.
Hello.
Hello, also from my side. Good morning to you and good evening to the audience.
Matthias, hi.
Are you all in Salzburg or all in throughout Austria?
We are all in Salzburg, in Austria, yes. The most of us in Austria, not all. We also have participants from Germany and I think also from Switzerland. So we are the international German-speaking countries. And Matthias will lead you through the whole session. Matthias?
Hi, happy to see you again.
Nice to see you again. Yeah.
And Patrick will again be our technical master for the Zoom meeting. And also Matthias will introduce supplementary questions. If people want to bring in questions on the fly during the meeting, during this Zoom meeting, and we can bring it in if time and context allows it. So I will hand over now to Matthias.
Yes, thank you, Herbert. Yeah, happy to do the interview with you today. We already met actually with the 2 meetups with Gerhard Fatzer, maybe you remember.
Yeah, sure.
I was there, exactly. And I will do the interview with our 2 students, Stephanie and Susanne. And yeah, like Herbert already mentioned, we have 3 content blocks actually prepared with all these questions that were handed in beforehand from our audience. So there are around 200 people listening in the background. And we will talk about 3 contents. The one will be about current developments organizations have to deal at the moment with the pandemic and with digitalization. The second block will be around agile transformation from organization design to mindset. And the third one will be agile transformation focusing on the humble leadership concept. Exactly. And before we come to these contents, we want to start with a short check-in round, okay? And yeah, you're probably used to many check-in rounds and introducing yourself. So we try to make it a little bit differently today. We want to ask you to introduce each other. So I will ask a question to Peter concerning to Ed, and then I will ask a question to Ed concerning to Peter, okay? So maybe it's a little bit more exciting than for you as well, okay?
Okay.
Perfect. We start, I will ask Peter first, okay, concerning a question to Ed. How did actually Ed get in touch with the topic of organizational culture and leadership? Maybe could you point out 2 to 3 main life experience that shaped him?
Sure. That's a wonderful question. And you know, asking us to introduce each other is sort of an unfair advantage since we're father and son and we've been introducing each other for over 50 years. But at any rate, glad to take the challenge. I think there's a couple of things. One, and again, Ed can correct me, but these are things that I've heard him say. The first is that, you know, he was born in Switzerland and spent the first 10 years of his life in Europe. But not just in German-speaking Europe. So he was continually sort of having to be adaptable and flexible on his own, given that at age 10, he had already lived in 4 languages, I believe, German, Czech, Russian, and is that right, Ed? Czech, yes?
And then English, yeah.
And then English. So, a sort of an ability to kind of be situationally aware and context aware, I think, was part of his childhood. And for me, the other part of the question that's important is that the ideas around organizational culture were happening in the early, for Ed, were happening in the early 1980s, when he had been consulting for many years with Digital Equipment Corporation and effectively coaching Ken Olsen, who is the founder and CEO. And he had been consulting with Ciba Geigy, the Swiss merged chemical and pharmaceutical company that's now Novartis. But even then was a merged company of the Ciba people and the Geigy people. And so he was sort of trying to process, what am I seeing in Ciba Geigy, this Swiss but merged company? So it's not just one culture, it's two cultures. They're both Swiss, but you know that there's a lot of layers there. And then by contrast, Digital Equipment Corporation, which was one founder, one geography, one absolutely driven engineering mission. So a lot of what developed into the organizational culture and leadership first edition was because he was seeing these incredible contrasts between what's happening at a northeastern, U.S. startup that was a single mission versus a big combined Swiss traditional. There was nothing traditional about Digital Equipment Corporation. They were, IT people creating a new future versus, the established Swiss chemical company.
So being
so
in
that's
touch,
what that's what drove a lot of what Ed had to sort of process and became the theory in organizational culture and leadership. I'll also say that at the time I was studying social anthropology at undergrad in California here, and my older sister was starting a PhD program in cultural anthropology at Cal at Berkeley. And so we sort of joked that in a way that was the foundation of the family business, that we're all sort of, social anthropologists at heart. I took some other career steps that diverge dramatically from that, but now we're back with the family business. Yeah.
Okay, so being in contact and in touch with so many different cultures over life would be a central point actually that shaped Ed. Would you?
Yeah, and for a lot of you Europeans, that's easier because it's all so much closer. For a lot of Americans to experience a lot of different cultures is you really have to be quite intentional about traveling, and a lot of people don't do that, which is why sometimes Americans can come across, rightly so, as pretty provincial. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So we have a starting question for you, Ed, again. Concerning to Peter, could you summarize actually what fascinates Peter about researching and consulting organizations? What is he paying attention for in some sentences?
That's an interesting question because initially this relationship developed from Peter's side. I was very busy writing my autobiography and learning how to retire in this California setting, but I had chosen to be out here with Peter because I needed to be near one of my children, and Peter was by far the logical and best choice. But I did not anticipate that about 5.5 years ago, he would walk in and say, hey, let's do something together. So I think it's important as to how the relationship formed, that it started with his initiating it, because it then led me to being very careful not to then grab hold and say, okay, you want to work with me, I'm going to teach you everything. That clearly seemed like was not what Peter was going to be interested in. So what I've learned through our various joint efforts, which have been very successful from my point of view, is that what intrigues Peter is how to think about things and how to develop metaphors and models and labels. And that was stuff that I never even occurred to me often.
Mhm.
So what's been the most fun is not to be able to answer your question yet, because even to this point, I don't know fully what really intrigues Peter and what his contribution will be on the next go around.
Mhm.
And that's what's exciting for me, is to be working with someone who is evolving, and I'm not even sure in what direction.
Interesting.
What, one other point, before we talk some more about Peter, I want to close the loop on my evolution. As a professor in the business school, we had a lot of European students and contacts, and I developed a lot of European contacts, and the two most important ones that you may not be aware of is that I was working in Vienna with a group that was at that time the only place where group dynamics was being taught. And I've now forgotten the colleague professor, but it was a very active program, and maybe you know, this would have been in the 70s and 80s. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, probably. There were two, maybe it was Traugott Lindner, I don't know, or Traugott Lindner from the Austrian Society of Group Dynamics.
Well,
Gerhard
Doc
Schwarz.
Lindner was a close friend from the Bethel Labs.
Yes.
This was a master's program in group dynamics that
Mhm.
was not related to Doc Lindner.
Okay.
But then the other connection was there is a very creative consulting company.
I just checking the chat. Maybe it was Ralf Grossmann. Do you know?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yes. Lieselotte Swatschek, actually a colleague of mine, she just wrote it in the chat. That was Ralf Grossmann. Yes, he's also.
And I had several very intimate sessions with his group and with this consulting company that's in Graz, I think.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the Lieselotte.
What's the name of that one? I've forgotten that too. I forget names.
Klaus Kahler. Probably Klaus Kahler.
Is
And the,
it
and the
ICG?
company
Is
name,
that
it's what?
ICG, is that right?
We will figure it out actually in the next 45 minutes, because there are lots of people in the background actually who are involved in this group dynamics labs, also in Graz. Maybe they will send me some information.
They invited me there, so I
Yeah.
spent time there with them. And they send me Christmas presents every year.
Nice.
And they're usually some very creative thing.
Perfect.
Like,
so you are really in contact with the Austrian Society. That's great. That's nice to hear. Okay, thank you for this check-in. Yeah, wonderful.
Deep connections with more deep consulting connections with Austria than any other European country.
Another colleague of mine wrote the OSB, maybe. There was the consulting company in Vienna. They took some ideas from you with the Carrie Anker, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. Okay, we'll figure it out. We have 45 minutes to talk, a little bit more. And I will hand over to my two student colleagues, Susanne and Stephanie, with the first content question about current developments that organizations have to deal with at the moment. Please, Stephanie.
Exactly. Thank you, Matthias. Such a pleasure meeting you, actually. After studying all your publications during the master's degree, it's a great pleasure. So we said we wanted to start with those current developments, because actually, especially COVID-19, it's really a global experience. No? So we're all challenged in our daily way of working. So our first question for you too. So the next questions will be open. So no, not for one of you, but you can just answer as you like. And our first question is, which long-term effects on organizational culture and our way of working do you expect from the pandemic?
Do you want to tackle that first, Peter?
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing is that our view of organizational culture is that it's, in the definition, it's sort of the combined learning of an organization facing challenges of external adaptation and internal integration, right? That's our technical definition. But if we break it apart a little bit, in our latest culture book, we described the idea of there's the structure of culture and there's the practice of culture. And the structure of culture is the three-tier model that you're familiar with, the artifacts, espoused values, underlying assumptions. And those really are, in a way, a rear view mirror of an organization. They're the accumulated history, and with the one exception there being that often the espoused values are an expression of where a company wants to go, but we often note that issues of, when people feel like they have a culture problem in their organization, a lot of times that's a gap between those espoused values and the deep underlying assumptions. In other words, the company tries to change and they realize they can talk about change in their espoused values, but their underlying assumptions of the organization are very stable. Those take a long time to change. And so in that regard, the idea of, 18 months of pandemic and a different way of relating to each other, having a direct and immediate impact on culture is sort of, in our mind, I don't know if that's the right question. Because yes, it will, but the real changes in culture take so long to manifest themselves that it's, in a way, if you think about the sort of the mission or the purpose of the organization, I know we'll be talking about that later. In some respects, the pandemic forces us to reinforce those more than it forces us to change those. In other words, we're dealing with this external adaptation and this internal integration, and we're saying as an organization, we still do what we do. We're not going to let the pandemic change that for us. On the other hand, the other thing that we like to talk about with culture is that it's a three-layer practice model. So it's structure and practice interacting with each other. And the practice model is three layers from the technical culture, that's the expression of mission and purpose. And then how we're designed around that, the organization design around the strategy and the tactical implementation. That's what collectively we call that technical culture. And then the social culture is how we relate to each other, how we tend to interact. Is it very structured? Is it very informal? Is it very confrontational? Or is it very passive aggressive? There's lots of ways that human beings and groups tend to, create patterns of how they relate to each other. So that's what we refer to as the social culture.
But
and then the last
definitely been changed, no? Like the social culture aspect through the way of communicating and working remotely.
Absolutely, you can change those, quite dramatically. But again, and Zoom here is the perfect example. We've all learned how to relate in a different way. But did it really challenge the culture that has been with the organization since its founding? I guess I would argue we've made adaptations. We've made, small kind of changes in the way our social culture works. but that doesn't really mean that we're threatening the organization's culture, its deepest, assumptions. I want to share a quick story from my experiences from quite a few years ago at Sun Microsystems, the big international, client-server computing company. At one point, we had a tough quarter, and we had a long-standing tradition, a long-standing artifact of every kitchen around the globe on a Sun campus, in Sun workplaces, every break room or kitchen with a coffee machine, and on Wednesdays would have donuts. So somehow the organization figured out how to get donuts to every break room at Sun Microsystems internationally. And it was one of those artifacts. It was part of our social culture. Mm-hmm. And that because of a tough financial situation, and again, an external adaptation, we had to stop doing that. We couldn't afford it anymore. And there was a sense that, yikes, we have slaughtered a sacred calf. We have thrown away a key artifact of our culture. And I would view it as, it seemed like it for a week or two at the time, but then people quickly adapt. We didn't change our culture with that. Okay. We made a little change in the way we interact. We no longer had the donut conversation in the break room, but we didn't change our culture with that. Yeah. In some respects, I'd want to view the pandemic the same way. We did change the way we related to each other. And in some respects, I think and we'll talk about this later, but I think there's a great positive in how we've had to learn as humans on the planet and humans in organizations, how to not let something like this threaten our culture.
Yeah, no, thanks.
I think there's a net positive.
So the bottom line is, as grave as it might seem, the current change, you say that it's not big enough actually to change underlying organizational cultures and assumptions.
I mean, it could be, but it would be a mistake to assume that it is. Mm-hmm. It could be. Every company is different, but this is not the kind of thing that becomes a direct threat to culture.
Yeah. Okay, then let's head over, because the next thing is a more fundamental transformation. Susanne, please.
Yes, thank you, Steffi. It's really a pleasure to have you here tonight. Thank you for participating our Agile evening. Let's have a look at the more long-term and today's age of digital transformation or digitalization. What role does organizational culture actually play in enabling a successful digital transformation in companies?
Ed, did you wanted to make another comment, and then?
I think both questions presume something about organizational culture that I think is a mistake. I think, especially long range, if there have been changes, I think they've been in the occupational cultures. Mm-hmm. I think doctors may view their role differently today. Doctor-nurse relationships may look different as a result of the experiences that they've had together. So the word organization is what doesn't belong in there. If we're trying to really understand the pandemic, I think we have to look at society and occupations rather than organizations. Because I would concur with Peter that organizationally, just as an example, I was reading the newspaper, and Kaiser Permanente, this huge HMO in the US, is about to lay off 1,000 people. And so from a layman's point of view, to say what went wrong there? You would think the pandemic would enhance occupation, but apparently what they discovered was that they hired a lot of extra people to deal with a pandemic, and now they have to get rid of them. Well, that's organization going back to its normal stuff. But I don't think people are the same. And how that will play out in the long run is very interesting, because while the pandemic was going on, there's a tremendous amount going on in the US healthcare around the concept of improvement. Much of it derivative from the Toyota production system and the whole concept of lean. So all sorts of hospitals and groups of hospitals are hiring people to begin a set of improvement projects in their hospital systems. And some of those are clearly geared to long-range issues, some of which I think are maybe the digital issues, but many of which are saying, are there both in the technical cultures and social cultures of our organizations things that we could do better? And that might be as simple as doctors talking to patients in a more relational way, doctors talking to nurses in a more relational way, nurses not looking down. I was just talking to a woman here in this retirement home who headed the pharmacy department of the Stanford Medical School during her career. Her husband was a physician researcher. She spent her career running the pharmacy. And at lunch, we talked about this, and she said her life was made miserable to the degree that the doctors particularly and the nurses looked down on the pharmacy.
Mm.
A major cultural problem, probably in many hospitals, that the pharmacy is crucial to everything, and yet it is looked down upon by the nurses. So I think we may not yet know what will happen as hospitals digitize more and more. I know there are already problems with is it Epic or one of the big systems, doctors having to put everything into patient records and so on. So I think overall, it's a positive trend toward improvement with as yet unknown glitches in where people will have trouble. Mm-hmm. In the technical culture or in the social culture or both.
The other thing that I guess I would add is that this might be a place where we have to kind of overlay time on the idea of organizational culture and digitization, because the digitalization that's happening in the macro culture around us at home, in our whole lives, that's an inevitable force. It's that's happening, and that is a tailwind, as we like to refer to the change toward digitalization. But we know in the organization, there's the culture is a headwind pushing back against that. And a lot of the reason, unfortunately, I think, is because you don't have a lot of the digital native skills in many of the workforce, probably the more senior workforce, because they're older. So there is this notion of how do we capture the digital native skills that our youngest employees have, for whom this whole digitalization thing is not a challenge. It's not a question. It just is. It's the way we live. Mm-hmm. We always have a supercomputer in our hand.
Yeah.
We're always doing 3 things at once. We're the idea of a workflow that's entirely web-based Yeah, what isn't? So if there's a way to sort of capture those native skills as a way of overcoming the headwinds that of you know, again, at the risk of oversimplifying, the older members of our organizations who are, you know, struggling with that transformation. That's just sort of it's one of the ways that I think we have to be very mindful or very intentional in where the skills are in the organization to bring the learning process along, because that's what digitalization is. It's a learning process. I mean, all of the fancy IT stuff, that stuff gets solved, but the human learning part of it is the challenge, is the headwind.
We throw in the next question, yeah, because you have so many great long answers, but we have so many questions. Maybe we continue with another question, and you probably just continue talking then. Yeah,
exactly. I think you already transitioned to that. So if we say we want to have an organization that is, let's call it more agile or more affluent in this new era of digitalization, and then we refer to your 3-level model of organizational culture, where would you start? So you already mentioned some things, like you have to start integrating the new skills, for example, of younger employees. But if I am a quite established organization in the market and I know I want to be more adaptive, at which of those 3 levels do you have to start working to reach that goal?
Well, the short answer from my point of view is what we see in the medical arena around this adoption of this improvement value. Suddenly everybody's interested in improvement. And I don't know to what extent this is true in Europe as well, but it's quite striking how this Toyota process and the whole idea of lean manufacturing and reducing waste and improving processes, how that has taken hold in the US. Not always successfully, because Boeing, with all its problems, was deep into using all the lean programs, but that didn't save them from people lying to each other and not using all the knowledge they had and ending up with a scandal. So I'm not saying lean actually solves these problems, but the interest in improvement is something that I think you can go to the CEO who may not be interested in the details and convince him that all the other companies are using these programs, so he or she better also have a program. I see a lot of that happening both in the middle and at the tops of organizations.
So if I refer back to what Peter was saying in the beginning, that those values and norms are also showing where an organization wants to go. No? They include a bit more of a wish or of a future idea. So as you said now, maybe lean is my future idea or value. So that's a good starting point, because then I create this gap between where I want to be as an organization and where I currently am. And that's where development processes can kick in. Could you sum it up like that?
I think so, but I want to add one layer onto this, and that is that we be very clear when we're talking about an agile organization, where maybe it's agile with a small a, versus agile software development, agile with a large A. That agile software development is a very specific thing. You know, it's Scrum, it's sprints, it's user stories, it's scored stories. It's a very specific process that was layered on top of a very, very forward-thinking, future-proofed manifesto, right? If you've read the Agile Manifesto, there's nothing in that we can't agree with. That just absolutely sounds right. But when you get into layering these processes on top of that manifesto, you end up getting into the same organizational problems that often occur. You know, the marketing department owns user stories, and the engineering group gets to score those user stories. Well, right there, you've got two same silos that the waterfall method didn't help with either. So I just think there's such an important distinction between Stephanie, as you were implying, that the value of being adaptive or agile with a small a, and the processes that you decide you're going to implement because they will make you agile. So applying a hard and fast, Scrum and sprints and all of that, if your organization isn't really ready for it, is going to be problematic. You can't say we're going to do this agile transformation, agile software development transformation in a quarter. It's you, and that's why I think the idea of creating small teams, creating sandboxes, I think those things are very valuable because, you learn through experimentation. Well, you can't experiment with the entire core business, but you can experiment around the edges and sort of drive a spirit of success from successful experiments. I have a couple other framings to add. I know I'm a chatterbox this morning, but one is one of my favorite quotes right now is from a T.S. Eliot play from 1934 that somehow just captured for me what this problem is, that he's referring to sort of challenges that humans face. And he says, we're dreaming of designing systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. And the good in humans making adaptive moves, making quick changes, making pivots, that's how organizations progress. That's how organizations evolve. It's not because they designed systems so perfect that people didn't need to be good. People still need to be good. People still need to be present. They need to be aware. They need to be, as worried about context as they are content. And so one of the just the last things I'll share with you is the sort of the 80-20 rule, which is, can you find 20% of your productive week to not be working on your job? Because if you're just working on your job 100+% and just focused on the content of your work, you're going to miss stuff that's going on around you. So can you spend 20% of your time either asking, how is our group working? Not are we getting it done, but how are we working? And or what's going on outside of our organization that we better be paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. Because you took away, or you already answered some of our questions, because we said one very interesting thing is how to integrate more agile or more fluid processes into an existing company. And from what I understood, it's basically creating those little fields of experimentation and also experience where people can start using those methods, maybe in a project setting or something, which can not only be just putting on the methods on an existing company without changing anything else, but kind of creating a safe space where you can start making your experiences and integrating those experiences into the company, into the organization.
I think that's right. That one of the core ideas in design thinking is fail fast, right? Well, if you tell the core of the organization, you're making jet engines, and you tell the core of that organization, well, we're going to change some stuff, but we're going to fail fast so that we learn quickly. Well,
No, and I
you're not
think
going
the
to
core
do
of
that with the jet
organization-
engine
Yeah.
core business. It's just, that's not practical,
Yeah,
because they still have to, make jet engines that don't explode in the air.
they're safe. Yeah.
But Peter, you
That's
picked a
also-
terrible example because that's exactly what Musk is doing.
Well,
He's failing
Yes.
one rocket
No.
after another.
No, that's
well,
not-
but
In the big
but,
way.
Ed, I think you're right, but I think the difference is that SpaceX started with this. SpaceX started by developing around design thinking and
That's right.
and agile software development, and so but I think we're talking more about companies that are looking to transform themselves.
Yeah.
And without creating safe spaces to experiment and learn from those experiments, and over time, work those new principles into the core business.
Yeah. And what I liked was the word that you used, like the core of an organization, because we prepared another question for that.
Yes, that's a good hint. Thanks, Steffi. As we all know, agile or agile organizations are purpose-driven organizations. So what do you think, what role does purpose play in today's age of digitalization, or how would you say you can best implement purpose into, or embed purpose into the organizational design?
Or is it just another concept, actually?
I find that an impossible question because purpose is, of course, now a big deal. Theoretically, everything works better if you have purpose. But purpose, by definition, comes out of a human being's own thing. It's not something you create for people. So the question of what would we do about purpose, except to say, if you don't have purpose, you're not going to do as well. People won't relate as well. You can make that observation in your clients, but other than saying, asking theoretically, what is your purpose? What my mentor, Richard Beckert, always started every strategy change meeting with, what is our reason to be? Why do we exist? Why does society allow us to exist? So I would say the question is terribly important for the beginning of any change program. I would leave it at that. To force the client to think that through.
But the question is not new, right? It's still the same question somebody asked you 30 years ago.
In maybe with different words.
Yes.
But I think organizations that don't think about it and say, or they're dumb about it, our purpose is to make money. And they don't realize that that's not really a viable purpose, because society grants the private sector is granted its license to operate in order to produce something for society. And to make you do that, you get to keep some money and make profit. But if you don't produce goods or services for society, you're not going to last as a business. So purpose has to be real, not something trivial.
And there's one question, maybe just from looking on the chat. What makes a viable purpose then in your view? Could you answer it very shortly? Do you have an answer?
What makes a what?
A viable purpose then in your view?
Well, I think the answer is what customers will buy. I think in the end, one of the most interesting studies of innovation is that if you look at how companies really innovate, it turns out to be it's their best lead customers who say this product isn't good enough for us. We want you to change it in the following way. Or could you or tell the hospital, you know, you ought to have a different kind of service. Then the hospital or the manufacturer says, hey, that's a good idea. I will incorporate that. They get new patents and they get all the credit for innovation, but the push for it came from the customer. So without customers, there's nothing.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. There's one last topic. We want to just take a glance at it. You are, I guess, an expert in humble leadership, and you published or one at least or more books about it. So what do you think, what is the power of humble leadership actually in the for the current or also for the future success for companies?
Well,
Ed, why don't I take the first stab at that, just so that we're on the same playing
I wish
field?
you would.
Because it all starts with what that means, because humble is the kind of word that, you know, means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It may mean something different given your you know, your cultural or religious background. It might, you know, mean something different depending on where in the organization you work. So we wanted to, in the Humble Leadership series, we wanted to try to make humble something that's available to everybody. In other words, your personality could be very brash and arrogant, but humility is not something that's beyond you. Humility is, in our sense of this term, is something it's a here and now idea, and it's embracing the fact that given the you know, complex and dynamic and challenging market context or social context that we all exist in, we have to embrace the fact that we don't have the answers. Humble means I kind of know what I know, and I have to accept that those around me that I work with ultimately collectively know more than just I do. So if I'm the leader, my biggest obligation and challenge is to go into work saying, I don't have the answers. I may think I'm the smartest guy in the room. I may think I'm the top of the totem pole of the hierarchy, but I still have to look around me and say, collectively, the group knows more than I do. So that's what humble means. And leadership then means, how do we draw all of that knowledge out of the groups that we work with? How do we do something that's new and better because we did a better job of capturing and acting on information? So that's what humble leadership means to us. And then Ed, if you want to take it from there.
I think then we get to the phrase that leadership is a group sport. We no longer talk about leaders. We talk about leadership as a process that can occur anywhere in the organization, can come out of anyone in the group who sees a better way of doing something. And so it puts the emphasis on what I think is the most important idea that has come out of our work, that in the end, it's all about relationships. That it's not something that you look for traits in the individual, or if you needed a trait, you would say the most important trait is the ability to form level 2 personal relationships with the people around you. Because only in interaction, in relationship, do you begin to get together what ends up being the right agile idea, or the right way forward. That's rarely something that just comes out of one person. It's almost always something that comes out of interaction, out of teamwork. And so what we're really promulgating most of all is this idea of a ladder of relationships that's all the way from a dominating relationship, which we call -1, to a purely transactional, psychologically distant relationship, which we call level 1, to a more personalized relationship where you get to know the people with whom you interact and work as whole human beings rather than just someone in a particular job role. And out of those level 2 relationships come the new ideas and the leadership processes. And if the relationship, if the task is super complicated, then you may even get to level 3, where you have a more intimate relationship that's usually reserved for friends and relatives, but may be necessary if you're a working team that's doing life-threatening operations, or it's a SEALs team capturing someone, where you train together and become even more intimate. So this ladder of relationships underlies this whole notion of why humility is important. Because to form a level 2 relationship that's more than just transactional, you really have to make yourself vulnerable. You have to be more open. You have to be more inquiring. You have to be willing to admit your ignorance and get to know each other better.
So, and how would you say you can ensure that humble leadership will not be misunderstood as a kind of weak leadership, let's say?
As a kind of what?
Weak leadership.
Weak, you
Weak.
know, I'm
I know.
Yeah.
Well, I use the term vulnerability. It's your choice as the observer to call that weak. I think the people who practice it don't feel weak, even though they may be perceived by the level 1 transactionalists or the dominating types. They say, yeah, that's weakness. You can't get away with that. Why can we argue for level 2 and making yourself vulnerable? Because it's the only way you get these complex tasks accomplished. The work itself has changed. You used to be able to get the work done dominating people and building assembly lines and making everything machine work. But as Peter will point out, everything that a machine can do will get done by AI and machines. And what will be left will be the complex problems that machines cannot do. And those can only be solved by individuals who will say, hey, I really need help. I learned this early as a consultant. All my expertise got me nowhere. But if I said, look, I'll think with you, I'll work with you, I'll try to be helpful and make myself more accessible and vulnerable, I didn't feel I was being weak. I felt actually I was being strong in that I understood helping and problem solving better than my client, and that this had to be a joint process.
There's a interesting question in the chat actually concerning humble leadership. If there are more female leaders actually in the organizations now, and do they have an influence on embed humble leadership in organizations? Is there any answer?
What's the question?
Do you think that that the influence of female leadership female leaders bringing more possibilities or more power into embedding humble leadership, or not?
We wish. We don't know.
Yeah, and we're you know, there were probably 30 times in writing the humble leadership process, or the book, and talking about the humble leadership process, that we might have found ourselves wanting to refer to what I think Frederick Laloux referred to as feminine values. And we just didn't feel like that was fair or correct. It's like there may be some, humans may have adapted different ways of interacting with each other. So a group of women interact one way and a group of men interact in another way. But to sort of put it as a feminine value just didn't seem quite right to us. It's more have we learned to be successful collaborating?
Yes.
And that's not a gender specific thing. It's
now,
just that there's been this association with the idea that women may be naturally more collaborative with each other whereas men are always trying to, zero sum. It's all, men are always trying to beat each other. But I guess the other comment that I would make on the weak idea is that, do we know of a senior vice president or a CEO who was removed from their position because they were weak? I mean, no, they were removed from their position because they failed to deliver what they were supposed to deliver.
There is another question.
It may be just that we perceived it as they were weak, but in the end, it's not. We don't remove people from senior leadership because we perceive that they're weak. We remove them because there's some metric that they didn't live up to, right? And so I would argue that person who may be very weak, who's very good at being situationally aware and gathering all of the insights and intelligence in the room, and making the best decisions. It's the decisions that you make that get you fired, not whether you're perceived to be weak or not.
Yes, that's probably also an answer actually on the question we had in the chat. What about employees misusing the humble leadership concept and taking advantage of humbleness? But I think you already answered it, how humble leaders actually have to play or have to act, that this humbleness are not misunderstood by employees. Okay, we already actually 5 minutes to go. So now all the interesting questions coming up in the chat, but we have just 5 minutes left. So I will ask you 2 last questions. There was one question in the chat at the beginning, would be maybe quite interesting. Is there any extent Austrian authors have on your work, like Paul Watzlawick or Heinz von Förster? Do they have any impact on what you did at Austrian researchers, authors like Paul Watzlawick, Heinz von Förster, Germans, Niklas Luhmann? Actually, do you look to Europe when you do research to organization developments?
I would say absolutely, but the more we practice, the less we read. So I'm sure there is a ton of important literature that I am unaware of, not because I'm not interested, but because I don't read until someone tells me. And so I would have to say, I don't know whether there are important Austrian figures.
And how is it with you, Peter? Is there any person in Austria or in Europe actually doing organization research that you're looking at?
Well, I mentioned Frederick Laloux because that book made a big difference to me as I was trying to get going with Ed on writing humble leadership. But that idea of the sort of historical context of organizations, and that there's as he says, there's something is in the air.
Yeah.
There is this sense of the teal organization is doing it in a different way, and we ought to be very, very conscious of how they're doing it that's different. And that's where part of where I think the purpose question came from.
Yes.
That
yeah.
there is the sense that, you know, whether it's in the US, it's Patagonia, is, you know, clearly is a purpose-driven organization. And there's something a little bit different there
Yes.
than just sort of, you know, continuing to grow every quarter. There's something else going on.
Okay, thank you. I have a last question, final question I want to ask to Ed. What would you name actually as one of your most important life learnings on leadership or people and organization management? We know it's an ocean of information and experience, but maybe you can point out one central point of your life learnings concerning to leadership and organizational culture.
Become situationally aware of the relationship potential in every situation you find yourself in. Everything happens through conversation and through relationship. So every new situation I'm in, rather than looking at it geographically, look at it relationally. Who else is there? And what's the potential in talking to the others who are in the situation? I'm really getting more and more convinced that the world is not about individuals. The world is about relationships. And if we don't start there, we're going to keep making silly theoretical mistakes like, well, if everybody gets to be more emotionally competent, the world will be better. No, if everyone gets to be relationally more competent, yes, possibly the world will be better.
Perfect. We sound like really, really perfect last final words for our really, really interesting interview. It's 8 o'clock p.m. At our Austrian time. You start the day. We finish the day. Thank you very much for this great interview and the time you spent with us. Thanks for Stephanie and Susanna asking the questions. And yeah, hope for another chance to talk to you again sometime in the future.
Thank you very
much,
so much for having
Peter
us.
Schein and Ed Schein for this time. Thank you. Herbert.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you also from my side for sharing your massive experience with us. And best wishes from Europe, and especially for the German-speaking countries. And we wish you the best and a good day. Bye.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a good
you.
time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.